Hey everyone, Duke here, and I've had a lot of questions about some basic Solar 3.0 builds to run, so I'm going to go over one build for each class that I'm currently running. These builds all have a focus on one portion of each class's kit, and a strong and satisfying gameplay loop to play with. Starting with Warlocks, we're using Starfire Protocol to get a bit of a loop going with the fusion grenades and the rifts. Basically, using Starfire Protocol, you're able to get your rift back by getting a fusion grenade kill, and then by standing in an empowering rift, you're able to get your grenades back incredibly quickly. Looking at the subclass then, of course we are going to use Empowering Rift in order to be able to get those grenade backs with Starfire Protocol. Also note that using Well of Radiance will count as well, but obviously your super is going to be on much longer of a cooldown than your rift will be. Your jump and your melee don't really matter too much for this build, you can use whatever you're comfortable with, but you're definitely going to want fusion grenades as that is going to be the main part of the build, again with Starfire Protocol. In terms of aspects, you're absolutely going to want to use Touch of Flame. This is going to allow your fusion grenades to explode twice and do insane damage. As for your other two aspects, you have the choice between Icarus Dash and Heat Rises. I personally use Icarus Dash. I really do enjoy the ability to Icarus Dash, and also we now have the ability to get a cure or basically healing effect when you get rapid defeats while airborne. That part is honestly not going to happen all that often unless you're really trying to play around it, but quite honestly, neither Heat Rises nor Icarus Dash are too incredibly important to this build, so just choose whichever one you want. In terms of fragments, I'm running Ember of Ashes, which allows for more Scorch stacks to be applied to targets. Your fusion grenades here are going to moderately scorch targets, and when you stack your fusion grenades and start throwing a bunch of them on a target, a lot of times for like a DPS situation, you're going to get ignites off. And you really want to get as many of those ignites off as you can to get even more damage, and by allowing yourself to apply more Scorch, you'll get ignite faster, you'll get more damage faster, and this is just a nice fragment to use. Next, I'm running Ember of Solace, basically to extend Classy Restoration's length. You can also use Ember of Torches to get your melee attacks to allow you to become Radiant. I don't personally use that in this build. You definitely can, and it would definitely be a very solid potential option, but that would also extend your Radiant effect if you're going to use Torches as well. My third fragment is Ember of Char. This is probably where I would put Ember of Torches if indeed you wanted to run it. This allows for your solar ignitions to spread Scorch to affected targets. Again, talking about earlier with the ability to spam fusion grenades, you're going to end up getting ignitions and being able to spread Scorch and even more Scorch to targets. Plus the 10 Discipline is pretty nice. Again, the Discipline's not going to matter as much just because the build allows you to pretty much every time you get a rift down to get your grenades back super duper fast, but it's an interesting option. And lastly, we're running Ember of Wonder, again going back to that thought with ignitions, granting an Orb of Power if you get multiple targets defeated with said ignitions. Mostly though, honestly, I'm running this for the 10 resilience because 100 resilience is just nuts right now, so any way you need to get to 100 resilience, you definitely want to do. Honestly, for this Warlock build, the fragments are mostly your choice. Really the only things you absolutely must run for this build are, again, Empowering Rift, Fusion Grenades, and Touch of Flame. Really quickly, in terms of mods, I'm running Explosive Wellmaker to allow for any sort of explosive damage that I'm doing, including my grenades, to make Solar Elemental Wells on top of basically whatever heavy I'm using for Ammo Finder for the helmet. On my gloves, I'm using High Energy Fire so that whenever I become charged with light, which I'll explain how I become charged with light in a second, I can get more weapon damage. Usually just using whatever champion mods I need on these middle slots. You can also potentially have a little bit of space for a reloader, or maybe a fastball, or basically whatever you want to use here, nothing super important. On my chest piece, I'm running Elemental Ordnance to get even more Solar Elemental Wells when killing stuff with grenades, and this will actually stack with Explosive Wellmaker to get more Elemental Wells, but again, Explosive Wellmaker can potentially also work with other things, such as like Gallahorn. I'm also running Armor of the Dying Star on the both slots on my chest piece. Depends on what you're running for this. Obviously, you might want to have Concussive Dampener, or if you're doing something where you need Arc Resist, then you may want to have your chest piece on Arc just so that you have that flexibility. But again, using whatever resists you need here is going to be helpful. On my boots, I have Elemental Charge, which is going to be how I become charged with light. All those elemental wells I'm making, every single time I pick one up, that's going to give me 2 stacks of charge with light, which then will allow High Energy Fire to be able to be proccing and constantly giving me that damage buff. Again, here I run for the Scavenger, whatever heavy I'm using, which in this case would be Rocket. And finally, my class item and most important part of the build, we have Classy Restoration, which allows for every single time I pop my Rift, which is an Empowering Rift, to still give me 10 seconds of healing with the Restoration buff. That's going to be super duper huge and super duper important in terms of being able to survive without other healing effects. However, on top of that, we're also running Well of Life, which gives me another way to get healing effects, which, again, we're going to be making a lot of solar elemental wells with the 2 elemental well mods that we're running, and every single time I pick one of those up, we're going to get even more regeneration for a bit of time as well. Next, for our Titan Solar build, we are running Syntheseps. This allows us to basically get our Bonk Hammer to do more damage when we are surrounded, and that's going to be the entirety, basically, of this build, is going to be our Bonk Hammer. In terms of your super, you can really run either a Hammer of Soul or Burning Maul, not really important which one you use. I personally like Hammer of Soul, but either one totally will work great for this build. Starting off with the aspects, I run Roaring Flames and Soul Invictus. I really don't think there is any other option. I've heard some good things about Consecration, that it is pretty strong now, but Roaring Flames is going to allow your solar abilities to basically stack up damage, and it also will allow for, even if you for some reason lose your hammer now, you can still scorch targets and potentially make more sunspots, even without your Bonk Hammer. Now, Soul Invictus is going to be incredibly huge. This one is absolutely unquestionably must use in all scenarios. This allows for your solar ability Final Blows, Hammer of Soul impacts, and defeating scorched targets to create sunspots. These sunspots are going to keep you alive and are just insane, super duper strong. When it says solar ability Final Blows here, this means every single melee that you get with your Bonk Hammer is going to create a sunspot. And this is going to also be really easy to kill stuff with the stacked damage of Roaring Flames, the stacked damage of Syntheseps. It's going to be nuts. And if you've never used the Throwing Hammer before, which this is going to definitely be 100% the melee you're going to want to use for this build, it recharges every single time you pick it up. So if you throw it and hit something, you can pick it up right away, you have it back immediately. If you throw it and miss, again, if you go run up and pick it up really quick, you have it again. So like this melee is on a 0 cooldown as long as you don't lose it. If you throw it off the map or just completely lose track of where it is, you might lose it. But we do have a way in this build to get it back instantly even with that happening, so keep an eye out for that. Not only that, but if you do hit targets with this Bonk Hammer, picking it up again will grant you Cure, which is basically, again, just a quick little burst of healing on top of those sunspots, and is just a really nice little addition as well. I prefer the Towering Barricade just in terms of being able to protect myself a little bit more. Honestly, you can use the Rally Barricade as well, doesn't really matter, but I prefer the Towering Barricade. As for jump, use whichever one you want. For the grenade, I have been running the Solar Grenade. I actually think there is a lot of benefit, and honestly may switch to eventually the Healing Grenade to A, give you even more healing, which arguably you don't necessarily need, but with the Bonk Hammer, that's kind of allowing you to do your kind of AoE clear with the sunspots and being able to insta-kill stuff with the hammer itself. So do you really need like a damaging grenade on top of that? That's a question I'm asking myself. I am currently using the Solar Grenade just because I'm a little bit more used to it, but I really think there's a lot of potential for the Healing Grenade as well, or, you know, something like Fusion Grenades are still really strong, just like on Warlock. But the grenade definitely can mess around with some different things. There's other options, but definitely need Bonk Hammer, Roaring Flames, Soul Invictus, super strong. In terms of Titan for solar fragments, I am starting with Ember of Solace for that Radiant and Restoration effect to apply to have it even increased duration. The one thing here is you could actually argue that maybe you don't need this just because of how often you're going to be able to apply Radiant and apply that Restoration effect. I personally have liked running this. It feels good in case I don't have a chance to apply it quite as often as I may like, but that's actually definitely a solid argument. But for now, this is what I'm running as my first fragment. My second fragment is Ember of Torches. This is an absolute, really no reason not to run this fragment. Your powered melee attacks against combatants will now make you and nearby allies radiant. Again, this entire build is about melees, your throwing hammer, so you're going to just allow yourself to become radiant and allow your teammates to become radiant. You're going to have more damage, your teammates are going to have more damage. Absolutely 10 out of 10 would use this. My third fragment is Ember of Wonder. This allows, again, for defeating multiple targets with solar ignitions, just like Warlock, to create a Orb of Power. Again, really not running this for the perk itself, but the 10 resilience is super duper nice. That 100 resilience is like super helpful on both Warlock and Titan, and we'll talk about Hunter in a little bit, but 100 resilience, that gives you 40% damage reduction starting this season, is a new thing that they just added. Would highly recommend getting there, and on top of that, that also lowers your barricade cooldown on Titan, so 100 resilience, super useful. And finally, we have Ember of Ashes, where your Scorch stacks will now be, you'll basically apply more Scorch stacks to targets whenever you do apply Scorch stacks, and your Sunspots are applying Scorch. So now you'll just apply those Scorch stacks quicker, more explosions. If you get enough of those Scorch stacks going, you get the Ignite, more damage, super helpful, super nice. As for mods, we have some pretty similar setups to the Warlock with a couple of very important changes. Again, we are running high energy fire to get more damage when and if and when we do use our weapons, which we are definitely going to use our weapons at times, especially for like single target boss DPS situations or for range, of course. Obviously, the hammer is not great at range at all. Again, I am running the finder for whatever heavy I use at the time, which is rocket launcher for this example. Melee Wellmaker is our first very, very big change for the Titan setup because this is going to be nuts. Every single, I'm talking every single one, every single kill you get with your hammer is going to create a solar elemental well. And it is crazy how many you can get. You can just keep hammer, 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 like just every single kill is going to create a solar elemental well with Melee Wellmaker, and it's really strong, really helpful. Couple different ways we're going to use this in the build, but I would highly recommend, like, use this. Like, there's not a 100% unless you don't have it, use it. Next, we've got the chest piece, again, just using kind of whatever defensive resist mods we need for the time. We do have our elemental charge here as well to allow us to become charged with light for high energy fire. Again, with Melee Wellmaker, that's going to create our elemental wells that we then pick up to become charged with light with elemental charge. Just like with Warlock, we are again running Well of Life. Arguably, don't 1000% need it because Titans just heal crazy with sunspots, but every now and then, maybe you miss your hammer, maybe you just didn't get the sunspot. There are definitely situations where a sunspot isn't happening. This has saved my life many times since I've started running it on both Warlock and Titan, because you're going to have so many solar elemental wells that just gives you more options. If either A, you run into a sunspot, that heals you. You run into an elemental well, that heals you. Like, there's just all sorts of healing going on, all sorts of survival going on. Great mod with how many elemental wells and solar-specific elemental wells you'll be making. Again, with rocket launcher scavenger or whatever heavy scavenger that you may need. And our class item has the final change from Warlock. We are again running Classy Restoration, which arguably, again, I don't really use this very often. Like, you could use this to just go super ham, and then if you happen to like miss a hammer, or if I get myself in like a really bad situation and then miss a hammer and don't make a sunspot and really just need insta healing, this is your safety net. This is your insta way to just kind of survive for sure. You still have this ability to just get that restoration just on applying and popping up your barricade. But the interesting mod here is 1-2 finisher. So what this is going to do is this will allow for a finisher to restore your melee ability, that being your hammer. This will require 1/6 of your super, and this has changed from the very beginning of this mod existing. Before, I believe you weren't able to finisher at all if you didn't have 1/6 of your super. That is no longer true. You can still use finishers. If you don't have 1/6 of your super, it just won't give your melee back and you won't lose any super. On top of that, if you do already have your melee and use a finisher and you don't have enough super and all that, it will not take away your super. So there's no downside to using it in those situations. The only time you're going to lose that 1/6 of super is if A, you at least have that much, and B, you actually need your melee, which, again, for this build, you want your melee at like all times. So this is really super nice. It only costs 1 energy, easy to fit on here, and would highly recommend this, especially if you're someone like me that misses their hammer and potentially loses it more than I'd like to. And finally, we have Hunter, with Young Ahamkara's Spine being our exotic of choice. This is going to allow for our trip mines to increase their duration and blast radius, but mostly we're using this for the ability damage to grant trip mine grenade energy, and basically allowing the grenades and the melee we're going to be using to be kind of comboed back and forth and just getting into a nice little rotation of both of them. In terms of super, I'm using Blade Barrage. Technically, again, you could be using any of the 3 supers on Solar Hunter. Doesn't really technically matter based on this build. I think Blade Barrage is in a pretty good spot right now, though, and gives you a little bit more flexibility, so I would recommend Blade Barrage. I'd also recommend Gambler's Dodge, as this will allow for you to recharge your melee anytime you dodge near enemies, which is going to be a pretty significant portion of this build, as again, your trip mines are going to come back with ability energy, or ability hits, I should say, and your melee is going to be one of your abilities that you want to have to get those trip mines back faster. As for your jump, use whichever jump you want, no big deal. For melees, I'd recommend Knife Trick. This has a kind of triple knife effect. A, it makes it a little bit easier to use, and B, it also applies Scorch on hit, which is going to be important for a couple portions of this build. So this is definitely the melee I'd recommend. I think you could definitely experiment with some of the other ones and possibly get away with a different one, but this one has just seemed the kind of most straightforward to me. And of course, we are running Trip Mine Grenades, as that is what young Ahamkara Spine needs to work. As for aspects, we're running On Your Mark, which is going to allow us to get handling and reload speed anytime we get precision final blows. Also, activating our class ability will immediately grant those maximum stacks of On Your Mark. So we're going to be using our class ability quite often for multiple reasons in this build, and any precision final blows that we're getting will also give us this. And not only that, but it gives us 3 fragment slots, which is going to be nice as well. Secondly, we're using Knock 'em Down, which this is going to be the pretty much required aspect for this build. This is going to allow the supers that you use to basically be increased in terms of usefulness, but the bigger part is going to be the while radiant final blows with your equipped throwing knife will fully refund your melee energy, which we'll explain here in a second. I'm actually going to start in the middle of these fragments with Ember of Torches. This is going to, just like the Titan, allow your melee attacks against combatants to make you and nearby allies radiant. And just like we just mentioned here, while radiant, final blows with your equipped throwing knife will fully refund your melee energy, so combining Ember of Torches with Knock 'em Down means that if we throw our melee, and if we get a kill with said melee, we're going to get it back instantly. So that's going to be more Scorching and more ability energy to get back for our young Ahamkara Spine, and just killing stuff super nicely just by spamming throwing knives, just kind of how you would spam hammers in the Titan build. Next we have Ember of Singeing, which is going to again kind of go with that Scorch idea. This allows your class ability to recharge faster anytime you do Scorch targets. So again, your melee is Scorching targets, so every time you're throwing out a melee, and if you get a kill with it, you're getting it back, and you can throw out those melees constantly, which is going to get your class ability back faster. And if for some reason you either miss your melee, or don't get a kill with the melee, or whatever else, again, remember our class ability, which is getting reduced with Ember of Singeing, is Gambler's Dodge, which will get our melee back instantly when used. And not only that, again, going a little bit ahead in the build, but of course we are also using Class E Restoration for this build, so the more dodges you have, the more you can get that ridiculous restoration and healing that Class E Restoration brings. Next we have Ember of Solace. Radiant and Restoration effects will be increased, again with Class E Restoration, again with the Radiant effect that Ember of Torches is going to bring. This is just a super nice fragment to use. Our fourth fragment is Ember of Ashes. This will allow us to apply more Scorch attacks to targets. Again, we've got our Knife Trick applying Scorch, we've got Trip Mine Grenades applying Scorch, we've got all of our build kind of in this melee and grenade combo and being able to get them back and such. So this is going to be super duper nice to apply even more Scorch whenever we apply Scorch, which will then allow for Ignites and allow for more damage. And finally, we're using Ember of Searing, which is going to give us 10 recovery, not bad, and defeating scorched targets will grant melee energy, which again, going back to this whole build, we have a lot of ways to apply Scorch, and we really are very reliant on our melee and or grenade energy here. So even though we can potentially constantly refresh our melee with either getting a kill or using our dodge, this gives us even an additional way to get more melee energy. And a lot of times if you do throw out your throwing knives and if it doesn't quite kill the target, again, you don't get that instant refresh, but it will scorch the target, which then defeating it will give you that melee energy in return. So either way, you get at least some of that melee back. Now my stats here aren't quite what I'd want them to be, quite honestly. I haven't gone in and farmed the new armor that I'd want to for Hunter since they changed resilience. I do recommend 100 mobility, or at least as close as you can get. Again, that class ability cooldown with Class E Restoration and giving your melees back and all that type of stuff is going to be super useful. And for Hunters, if you didn't know, your class ability cooldown is tied to your mobility, so you want as much mobility as possible. I would, if possible, again, if I had different armor, want to get this resilience, again, closest to 100 as possible. I would definitely not mind taking away some recovery if I needed to. Recovery is still not a bad stat, but there are ways to get that restoration effect, again with Class E Restoration, and another way coming here in a second where I can give up some of that recovery and get some more resilience. So that's definitely something I'm going to be looking into as the season continues. As for mods, again, very similar mods to what we've seen so far. We have Melee Willmaker, same idea as with Titan. Our Hunter build is very reliant on the melees and very reliant on potentially refreshing the melees, so getting kills with our melee and our throwing knife, that being the melee, will give us the solar elemental wells that we're going to want to then also give us more energy for all of our class abilities. Next, we're running Explosive Well Maker to make even more solar elemental wells with anything explosive, which we have multiple ways in our kit just as a hunter to do that. Or if you're running any weapons that are explosive, I tend to run Galahorn a lot. Again, great option there. I'm also running Impact Induction, which will allow for causing damage with a melee attack to reduce your grenade cooldown. And again, the whole idea of this build is melees and grenades and allowing them to kind of refresh each other. So this is going to be super duper helpful. If you can't fit it in, if you need to run 2 champion mods for some sort of content, again, you might need to remove this. Next, I'm running Powerful Friends, basically just for the free 20 mobility. Super duper nice. We definitely want to be at 100 mobility or as close as possible, and getting 20 mobility just out of one of these mods is going to be quite useful. Once again, we are running Well of Life to give us even more potential healing and regeneration. Again, we have 2 ways to make solar elemental wells with this build, just like with the Titan build. And anytime we pick up those solar elemental wells, we will again start that instant regeneration, just like we had with the Titan. We now have that same build with the Hunter. And finally, on the class item, we kind of skipped ahead earlier, but of course we're running Class E Restoration. That's going to be that really just ridiculous amount of healing every single time we have our dodge up, which if you really get going into this build and are getting that refresh going and making sure to pick up those solar elemental wells and everything, you can basically have Class E Restoration up just about permanently. There'll be a little bit of downtime in between depending on how much you're killing and stuff, but you can have Class E Restoration up a very significant portion of the time. And not only that, but we have a little bit of extra boost with Utility Kickstart so that every time that we do use our class ability, we get a little bit of that class ability energy back. If you do happen to have Artifice Armor on your Hunter, I haven't gone in to farm Duality on my Hunter yet. I've been doing that a lot on my Titan this season to try to get it caught up a little bit, just of how strong it is. But I definitely want to get a cloak for the Artifice Armor. You can actually run 2 Utility Kickstarts here, and then you'll have this final slot in the 5th mod slot, where you can then put Class E Restoration there instead. Of course, you'd have to only use a 2 energy mod spot here instead of this +3 or this +10 for 3 energy. You'd have to maybe do a +5 for 1 energy or use something else that only costs 1 or 2. But having double utility kickstart can be very useful if you have the ability to do so. I hope this video helped you find some Solar 3.0 builds that are strong, fun, and effective. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.